One of the most absurd things I've ever heard. I had the opportunity to listen to Seymour Hersh uh, as he was informed of this and his live response. And after he stopped laughing and saying, "Oh my God," he said he couldn't believe that this was indeed the tactic being taken by the United States. This is absurd in the extreme. It's actually going to backfire because when you put up forward a cover story that's composed of lies, once those lies begin to be investigated, you just blow more holes in it, and you make the original reporting of Seymour Hersh resonate all the more. Especially a stupid cover up. Look, the CIA, and I've had the opportunity to work with their special activities group in the past. Um, Things they do aren't supposed to be discovered by the public. But one of the things they do up front when they are supposed to do an operation like this is develop a cover story as the operation unfolds that they can fall back on that is believable. What you don't want to do is after the fact, in a panic, start making stuff up. And that's what they've done here. This is the mother of all bad cover stories. Not just that they're gaining traction. Look, for intelligence people, they're pretty stupid. If you've studied Seymour Hersh's modus operandi in the past, you know that he doesn't write one and done. He writes a story, he lets it percolate, and then he receives more information. He writes a follow-on story, then a follow-on story, then a follow-on story. And Seymour Hersh has said that he has another, issue of the Nord Stream saga getting ready to be released, and then there will probably be another one after that. And what happens is, by the time he's done, it's all out there in black and white. The sources have come clean. We now can identify them. It's public knowledge. And it turns out that Seymour Hersh was right all along. I'm going with Seymour Hersh's track record as a journalist on this one, not the CIA's track record of telling the truth.
Question about Germany and Nord Stream, please. I know it's been done to death. The Germans have no interest whatsoever in identifying who blew up their critical national infrastructure. Doesn't make any sense to me. The German media, again, have no interest. They do have interest in smearing Hersh, the legendary journalist, and also reference the Minsk agreement. Germany and France, I know the story, they deliberately misled and lied to Russia to deceive them to buy time for Ukraine to arm. But why? What benefit was it to Germany in doing that? How did they gain? It just doesn't make sense.
Look, one only has to take a look at Olaf Scholz's face when he was in the White House with Joe Biden on February 7th of 2022, when Joe Biden said straight up, "I'm going to take out the Nord Stream pipeline." The look of abject shock and terror on the face. Scholz knew about this. He was told by the president right there, "I'm taking out your pipeline." This wasn't a surprise. Now, who is Scholz? What is the political parties behind them? In Germany, you have the resurgence of a progressive liberal element, the Green Party, etc., that is 110% beholden to the United States for their political viability. They've bought into American economic concepts, America's geopolitical vision of how Europe fits in the world. In Germany, these political and economic elites have totally sold out to the United States. This is why they're silent, because now they're confronted with the horror of what they've done, but they're too complicit. They're the ones who have set this thing up. They're the ones who allowed this to happen. So therefore, they're not about to allow the truth to come out. There are some elements in Germany, in the German parliament, who are courageously starting to ask the right questions. And as you indicated earlier, Seymour Hersh's reporting is starting to gain traction. The questions are starting to be seen as very relevant, and the silence on the part of the German government and the German media and other German politicians is damning in terms of how it indicts them in terms of their complicity in this what was a terrorist act by the United States. Well, let nobody be any doubt that Bakhmut is of extreme strategic value. This is, in a very important city. The Bakhmut Soledar complex of underground salt mines, entrenchments, etc., was the logistical and command and control hub of the defensive line that Ukraine had spent 8 years building in the Donbass region. Russia has spent since May grinding these defenses down in a very bloody, very violent operation that's taken tens of thousands of lives on both sides. Well, on the Ukrainian side, thousands of lives on the Russian side. And the Russians are about to win. They're about to break through, take Bakhmut. And as the Ukrainian president said, if Bakhmut falls, because he's now trying to explain why he's poured so many thousands of lives into the defense of this position that's getting ready to capitulate, he says if it falls, the door is wide open for Russian exploitation to go on to Kramatorsk and other Donbas cities. It will basically unfold the Ukrainian defenses. This is a strategic victory, not only in terms of the military aspects of it, but also the political aspects. One cannot, overestimate the amount of demoralization that'll take place on the Ukrainian side when Bakhmut falls. This was the strongest position. This was the most, heavily defended position, heavily fortified positions, and the Russians just cracked it like a walnut. And for the rest of the Ukrainian soldiers out there, they know that that is their future. As this war drags on, the best they can hope for is a death that is similar to the deaths that are taking place in Bakhmut as we speak.
We've spoken before about casualties. We spoke after von der Leyen inadvertently, perhaps, announced that the Ukrainians had lost 100,000 soldiers. We talked about the ratio of injured to dead, normally 2 to 3 for every dead soldier, 2 to 3 wounded ones. We're now talking about 250,000 dead and 250,000 wounded, which wouldn't meet that ratio I just referred to. But even if that was true, 500,000 dead soldiers in a year is not Second World War casualty figures, it's First World War casualty figures, isn't it?
Absolutely. Look, this is a humanitarian tragedy on a scope and scale that has been unimaginable in Europe in modern times. We had fooled ourselves, lulled ourselves into believing once the Cold War ended that the possibility of large-scale ground combat in Europe was over, that Europe was now, to quote Burrell, the garden. And there were no weeds, there were no parasites, it was perfect. Well, that's not the case. But as General Cavoli, he's the American general, commands American forces and all allied forces in NATO, said in a presentation to a Swedish defense forum in January, what's happening, the violence, the scope and scale of the violence is beyond the imagination of anybody in NATO. And this is a very important thing, beyond the imagination. That means that NATO hasn't prepared for this, isn't trained for this, isn't equipped for this, cannot sustain this. Frankly speaking, NATO cannot engage in the kind of fighting that's taking place in Ukraine right now. NATO would be wiped off the face of the earth. Ask the British military, all 70,000 of them. They wouldn't last a week in this kind of combat. Same thing with the Americans. We have more of our troops, but we don't have the ability to sustain them. We have no artillery ammunition in a war that's largely defined by the use of artillery. This is unimaginable, the level of violence. I say this over and over again because I'm trying to impart to your audience that this isn't Hollywood film. This isn't a movie. This isn't, minor deaths here and there. This is death on a scope and scale that the world has not witnessed since the Second World War, and more likely since the First War. This is trench warfare. This is gruesome. This is horrifying. This is the kind of stuff that if you survive, you don't survive, because your brain is going to be forever scarred by what you have witnessed. And it's not just the dead and the wounded, it's the participants. It's not just the combatants, it's the civilians. Tens of millions displaced. Look at what's happened to the landscape of Ukraine. And then ask yourself, was it worth it? Was what the West has done here worth the cost that we've imposed on the Ukrainian people? And I believe the answer isn't just no, but hell no. Well, it might be controversial to the politicians who have invested so much political capital into this failed gambit of supporting a proxy conflict against Russia using Ukraine, because they don't want to admit it. But, this is like the captain of the Titanic failing to acknowledge that they struck an iceberg and water's coming into his ship. He's just saying, go ahead, let's make New York in the morning. Well, you ain't going to make New York. and NATO isn't going to see this conflict through. NATO has lost this conflict. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, basically acknowledged it in a statement where he said, Ukraine is using 155 millimeter artillery ammunition at a rate greater than we can replenish. They will run out of ammunition this summer, and we have no ability to make up for this. And when you run out of ammunition in a war that's defined by artillery, you die. Vladimir Putin insinuated in his February 21st address that, Russia's goal right now is to, create a good social and economic life for the people of Russia. That includes Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, Lugansk, the new Russian territories, and then to secure them by pushing the Ukrainians back to the maximum range of the weapon systems provided by NATO, which is in this case 150 kilometers. That will give you Odessa, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkov, and those are Russian cities that Russia, once they have, will never go back. So not only is Russia going to seize another 30% of Ukraine and absorb it, but then what's left of Ukraine, understand, will not be a rump state. Russia talks about denazification, and I have spoken to several figures who've made it clear what denazification is. Denazification means that a military government will be put in to replace the Zelensky government, and all people who have been contaminated by the odious ideology of Banderism, these neo-Nazis, these white supremacists, will be arrested, will be prosecuted. There will be a Nuremberg-like reckoning to the Nazis and the people who facilitated this, and there will be punishment. Russia doesn't have the death penalty, so they will be given long sentences. And those who aren't sent to jail will be re-educated, and there will be a complete transformation of Ukrainian society. And this will take years because Russia cannot tolerate, and frankly speaking, Europe should not want to tolerate, a hate-filled, cancerous Ukrainian rump state that only exists to cause trouble for Russia at the expense of Europe. Ukraine, unfortunately, has been given a death sentence. Ukraine, as we know it, will no longer exist. Whatever emerge will be dictated by Russia as part of their terms of unconditional surrender that will be offered to whoever survives this conflict. The American empire is in a state of collapse. It's not a free fall yet, but it is definitely in a downward trajectory. And so the hegemonic powers that be that define the American political and economic elite are not, as Dylan Thomas said, going gently into the night. They are rage against the dying of the light. They're going to fight this to the bitter end. So there's a lot of rhetoric. Fortunately, the military people, the professionals, are cognizant of the fact that some of this aggressive rhetoric is a one-way trip to hell, which resulted in the military defeat of the United States. We simply can't defeat China in a non-nuclear conflict, and the military knows this. Every professional in the military knows this. They're going to say certain things, but at the end of the day, they will advise the President of the United States that to sail an American fleet towards Taiwan is to invite the destruction of the fleet, because the fleet is legacy thinking, old World War II, Cold War thinking that doesn't recognize the lethality of modern weaponry, these long-range, medium-range, precision-guided, hypersonic missiles that cannot be shot down, that will hit everything they're aimed at, will sink the entire U.S. fleet and everybody in it before it gets near Taiwan. And hopefully these guys are telling that to the politicians. Right now, the feeling is that China's bluffing, and that if we puff out our chest and we act strong, that the Chinese will back down. Well, the Chinese aren't bluffing. The good news is China's the adult in the room, and they recognize the temper tantrum when they see it, and they're going to let the Americans kick and scream and do what they want. But China, I believe, has made the decision, looking at Ukraine, that they are not going to go to war in Taiwan unless they are pushed, absolutely have to, that they do not want to engage in the kind of destructive activity that's taking place in Ukraine. That if Taiwan is going to be incorporated, they want it to be incorporated intact, with people alive, with the industries functioning, and the ability to engage in global economic activity, which is, of course, China's forte.